have PATRIZIA has about 17 billion euro under management in Europe. We have about 30 funds that we are managers of, and our investors is a diverse mix of German-speaking investors and international non-German-speaking investors. We have investors from the Nordic countries going with us to the rest of the European countries. The reason is not that the Nordic investors don't believe in their own market, because they do. The reason is that they either need to diversify. In case of Finland, please don't take it that the Finns pension funds are selling off in Finland as a sign as they don't believe in Finland. It's because until recently, about 95% of their real estate quota was in Finland, and they think they may have to diversify a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
So they're not selling off in Finland because they don't believe in Finland. They're selling off because they think they have to have a more diversified portfolio. They keep investing in Finland, they just invest more outside of Finland. Some of them have to reuse their equity, and that's why they have to sell a little bit, and some are actually still growing as pension funds. In the Nordic countries, what you need to keep in mind is that we have a tremendous mandatory pension program, more or less. In Sweden, if you pay an employee, and this is just a figure, let's say £1,000 a month, you have to put about 32% on top of that for social security and pension. And that's mandatory, you cannot get around it. In Denmark, most people put about 15% aside from their salaries for pension. So we all, and I think in Finland it's about 24%.
Yeah.
So you have to remember that these pension funds are getting bigger and bigger and bigger because we're saving so much money for our old age. And of course they notice, just like you notice, that the stocks and bonds market, the bonds you don't get too much out of unless it's really high risk. The stock market is fairly volatile compared to real estate. So they are not moving outside of the Nordic area into the rest of the world in Europe because they don't believe in the Nordics, but simply because they have to diversify.
I think one interesting part of that is that it's not, I think perhaps in the last cycle a lot of capital went going abroad, not just from the Nordics but more broadly, was then making the argument that okay, if I go to a new place I need to have a higher return in compensation for that. But I think there's much more preparedness now for capital owners to look at other markets for the main reason of diversification, not in the hunt of higher returns. And I think, for example, if you look at the US pension plans, they are now a lot bigger investor into the core segment than they have been in the past.
And do you think this, I'm interested about this, is this diversification a kind of new thing that hasn't been seen before? Is it accelerating, and is that creating in a way more liquidity into those markets?
I would say yes and no. I mean, Rikke pointed out the point about the Finnish pension plans. I think they are selling down or not increasing their investments in Finland because the desire to diversify. So I think that's quite important. But at the same time, then they make the argument that they are looking at it in comparison to their other asset classes, what they're doing elsewhere, and that's where the balance is lacking.
But
I would say that all the Nordic countries, but especially Sweden and Finland, have always been very international markets. But what's different these last couple of years, is that we've seen more cross-border transactions within the Nordic countries. So Swedes, when they have gone abroad, they've gone further outside the Nordics, but now they've done more in Finland and Norway especially. And same for the other Nordic countries.
I think what you have to bear in mind is that the Danish and the Swedish pension funds and the Finns and the Norwegian pension funds in the beginning invested mostly in their own countries. It's our money, they should help us make sure that we have some investments in our countries. So, because our labor markets are also very strong. But now, what we see in Denmark and in it's the same for all the countries, is that they go abroad. Partly because there are more competition about the assets, partly because they want to diversify, and partly because they have the same problem as a lot of other pension funds. There's not enough assets for them to, interesting assets for them to invest in, so they have to look outside. And that's because of their strategies. Another thing is you also have to remember is, and I think that's more specifically, maybe not so much for Sweden, but for the other Nordic countries, is they will buy more core assets in their own countries and go for the more opportunistic things outside the countries. Because if they lose the money, it's not, a Danish pensioner is not going to notice if they lose the money in South Africa, but they're going to notice if they lose the money on the high street of, you know, a small city in Denmark. Everybody's going to go, why did you go there? Sort of a C location. That's my money. So there's also some politics to this. The fact of the matter is that the real estate scene within the last 20 years has gotten more and more international. And we will see, you know, Swedish money in the US and US money in Sweden, Japanese money in the, you know, things have just changed. Now you are investing globally in the real estate market in a way that you didn't do 20 years ago. So what are they going for? They're going for areas where they think there is a risk award allocation that they can live with, and they find interesting. And most pension funds have an allocation for, as does private equity and all the others, all the investors have an allocation for core, you know, value add and risk, and then they will go to where they find that the risk reward allocation is the best for them. Nordics have been, and for the last few years and still is, called a safe haven. Reason is that, as you saw in our slides, we are doing fairly well compared to the rest of the European Union. And we have done, even though the Danish market went belly up because we had to learn from the Swedes when we were having a crisis in the 80s. The Swedish banks learned at that time. That's why they weren't affected as much this time, because they had learned their lesson. Hopefully the Danish banks have this time, because we all know the world is in cycles, so it's going up and it's going down. But even in spite of that, you can see it, in spite of Finland being 10 years ago touched by the Nokia, and right now the whole Russia crisis, I still feel that this Russia crisis is overrated towards Finland. The Finns have been able to change where one of the most important export partners was Russia. It's now Germany. They did that within 2 years. Show me in any other country who could do that. It's very interesting. You should go home and check the export, how it's changed from 2012 to 2014. Suddenly Germany is rising and Russia is going down. But one thing is that you say, okay, Russia is going down, it's because you can't sell to them anymore, deal with them, but that you manage to find somebody else who will take your export rates. Because the export rate in Finland is the same as it was before the Russia crisis. Now they just shifted it to other countries. I think that's pretty remarkable, because other countries wouldn't be able to do the same thing. Shows you a little bit about the Finnish mentality. So, yeah, I think I've spoken long enough, but it's the same.
One aspect too, you started off by saying the Nordics are safe haven.
Yeah.
One, I really agree with that, and that's something that we also hear a lot from international investors. One other reason to that is that all Nordic countries are considered very transparent. It's very easy to do transactions. In Sweden, if you come as a foreigner and you're going to do your first deal, easy to find information, good advice, and you also have a very high liquidity in relation to the total stock. It's actually the highest in Europe.